Hi, I'm Thomas from Neuzeit Instruments, artist name Hutenberger, and this is part 1 of my tutorial series on how I perform electronic music live. So the most noticeable thing about the setup is probably the big fat case behind me. It is a wild mix of more classic gear and a big Eurorack section over here that provides 3 synthesizer voices and some external audio effects as well. The synthesizer voices have very different styles, but they are all subtractive voices, which means that they are essentially one or more oscillators followed by a filter and a VCA. Each row corresponds to a synthesizer voice, and the top row contains audio effects and utility modules. In the middle, I also have some motorized faders and other control modules that I use to get what would be called macro mapping in Ableton. These modules are part of Matthias Kettner's Droid system, for whom I also work as an engineer. For example, I designed the hardware for the brand new M4 motorized faders, and I also did the hardware design for the P10 controller over here. The Droid modules in my setup will have their own part in another video, but in short, they allow you to program your own little circuits for anything that has to do with control voltages. For example, I built something that is a little bit like a preset functionality, allowing me to jump between different states of all the modular voices with the press of a button. The modular section is completely pre-wired, meaning that the cables are already plugged in, and I will not unplug or plug any new cables during the show. Some people do that on stage, but for the kind of music that I make, I really prefer to have a predictable setup. Eurorack can also be very difficult to handle on stage, as it can be a little bit unpredictable and confusing at some times. So I put a lot of effort into designing my 3 synthesizer voices and also into programming of the Droid controllers, so that the sweet spots are big enough and easy to reach for me. Taking the modular synthesizer on stage has the advantage that it can really sound good and very fresh compared to traditional synthesizers, because the combination and the signal flow of the modules are always unique. Anyways, I also have a regular synthesizer in my setup, which is the Korg Minilogue below. It is a polyphonic synthesizer with analog oscillators. I've had it for many years now, and I know it really well. So I can also play a little bit of piano, which is why I like to have keys in my setup. Down here I have an analog Rytm, which is a famous drum machine. I chose a used Mark I version because it is much smaller than the Mark II and it sounds pretty much the same. All the drums in my set are from this machine. So everything I covered so far are just the sound producing machines. But over here is also a MacBook running Ableton, which actually does not do very much in this setup. I mainly use it to fire off MIDI clips and also as an audio mixer. To feed audio into Ableton, I use a Neuzeit Instruments external audio interface that sits under the analog Rytm in the case. It is an old 10-channel audio interface that I've been using for DJing for years and years, and it has never let me down, so I trust it a lot, which is the reason why I really like to use it in this live set as well. One important point about the setup is that Ableton doesn't create any sound itself, so there are no VST instruments or samples involved. All the sounds are created with hardware synths only, and also mostly analog circuitry. And then I have the mixdown and some effects in Ableton. In my opinion, this is the best of both worlds, digital and analog, with the roughness of the analog world to create the sounds and the precision of digital signal processing for the mixdown. Speaking of mixing, up here I have a Novation MIDI controller that I use as a handy device for mixing in Ableton, running over here on the MacBook, and I also have an iPad hooked up as a remote controller. The app that I use is called LK, and I use it as an interface to start and stop MIDI clips. Actually, there is quite a lot going on underneath the launch control as well. So if I open this up, these are 3 big fat Meanwell power supplies for the Eurorack section over here. Since it can get quite hot down there, I added a small fan to each of the power supplies. The fans use the 5 volt output of the power supplies. For this video I unplugged the fans because the background noise maybe would be a bit distracting even though the fans are very quiet. On stage, however, I want to make sure the power supplies don't suddenly fail due to overheating, and the Electron Rytm is also happy about some cooling. The mains power cabling is also done here, including the power connections for the Rytm, the audio interface and an external USB hub. This is a MIDI to USB interface here that connects Ableton to the Rytm, and all the other excess length of the other cables, they also find a place here as well, making the actual user interface over here look nice and tidy. It's pretty cool though that there are actually only very few cables coming out of the case. That's just the power cable up here, 2 USB cables for MIDI and a dedicated cable for the audio interface, and 2 cables for the Minilogue. And that's it. I mean, for this much gear, that is really a minimum of cables, and on stage it is very handy. It only takes me a few minutes to set the whole thing up, including a little bit of a sound check to tune the oscillators right before the gig, and I'm ready to go. So this video was just a quick overview of the gear that I use. In the next parts of the series I will provide more sound examples and explain in detail what is going on in the rack, how the software part works, and cover a little bit about tips and tricks that might help you build your own live set. So stay tuned and see you then.